Everything you were taught about the first Americans crossing a frozen land bridge and walking straight into the continent is incomplete. The real story is far stranger. They didn't just cross and keep walking, they stopped. For thousands of years, trapped in a landscape that no longer exists, isolated from the rest of humanity, waiting while their DNA transformed into something entirely new. And the proof was buried 11,500 years ago in the skeleton of a 6-week-old infant in Alaska. The summer of 2013, the Tanana River Basin in central Alaska. Archaeologists were excavating an ancient dwelling site called Upward Sun River when they found something that would rewrite the entire timeline of human migration to the Americas. 2 infants, lying side by side at the bottom of a hearth pit. One had died between 6 and 12 weeks after birth. The other was a late-term fetus, likely stillborn or died shortly after premature birth. Both were carefully buried with red ochre covering their bodies, a ritual pigment used in ceremonies across ancient cultures. Valuable grave goods surrounded them, decorated antler rods, stone dart points, hunting tools that would have been precious to their community. This wasn't a casual burial. This was ceremonial. This was important. The local indigenous community gave the older infant a name, Ha-chi-ti-a-nen ti-de-gai, Sunrise Girl Child. The University of Copenhagen extracted DNA from her bones and sequenced her complete genome. When the results came back, she didn't exist in any database, not northern populations, not southern. Her DNA carried markers found nowhere else in the genetic record. They ran the analysis again, same result. They expanded their database, comparing her genome to thousands of samples from across the Americas and Asia. Still nothing. She was a ghost. She belonged to a population that had vanished. But the mystery deepened when they analyzed how long ago her ancestors had separated from other Native Americans. The genetic clock, the rate at which DNA accumulates mutations over time, pointed to a split that happened 20,000 years ago. 20,000. That's 7,000 years before humans were even supposed to be in Alaska according to the traditional timeline. And the genetic evidence showed something even more remarkable. Her people hadn't just arrived in Beringia and kept moving south like every theory predicted. They had stayed there, isolated, for potentially 15,000 years. The question nobody could answer was where. Where could a population hide for potentially 15,000 years without leaving any trace? Where could they survive completely separated from Asia on one side and the rest of the Americas on the other? The answer was a place that doesn't exist anymore, Beringia. Not the narrow land bridge you see in textbooks. A massive Arctic plain stretching from Siberia to Alaska and down into the Yukon, bigger than Texas and California combined. And during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of North America and sea levels dropped hundreds of feet, it was home. The scientists called this lost population the Ancient Beringians, a people who lived and died on a continent that has since drowned beneath the Bering Sea. Around 36,000 years ago, a population began separating from East Asians, but they didn't fully separate immediately. Gene flow, interbreeding between groups, continued until about 25,000 years ago. That's when the door closed. That's when the isolation began. Sea levels rose, ice sheets expanded, migration routes were cut off, and the people who would become the Ancient Beringians found themselves trapped in a refuge between two worlds. Too far from Asia to remain Asian. Too isolated from the Americas to join the migration south. For thousands of years, they survived in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. They hunted megafauna, bison, elk, the extinct yesterday's camel that stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder. They developed sophisticated stone tool technologies, creating tiny razor-sharp microblades from materials like obsidian and agate. At the Upward Sun River site where Sunrise Girl Child was found, researchers discovered the earliest evidence of salmon fishing in the Americas. These people weren't just surviving, they were developing complex subsistence strategies, adapting to an environment that shifted dramatically as climate changed around them. But that survival created a problem nobody anticipated, and while they lived isolated in Beringia, their DNA was changing, accumulating mutations at a predictable rate, creating the distinctly Native American genetic signatures that exist today. Two major maternal lineages emerged during this isolation period. Both of the Upward Sun River infants carried these markers, one from one mother, one from another, two different lineages, but both distinctly Native American, both proof that by 11,500 years ago, these unique genetic signatures had already formed, which meant her people had been isolated so long they'd become genetically distinct from everyone else on the planet. The isolation period lasted somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 years, depending on which genetic analysis you trust. Different studies using different dating methods produce slightly different timelines, but they all agree on the essential fact. There was a long pause, a genetic bottleneck, a period where a relatively small population, maybe just a few thousand people, lived separated from the rest of humanity in the Beringian refuge. Around 20,000 years ago, something happened. The ancient Beringian population split. One group stayed in Alaska. Those were Sunrise Girlchild's ancestors. The other group moved south. Those became the ancestors of every other Native American population that would eventually spread from Canada to the tip of South America. But if her people stayed in Alaska, that meant someone else reached South America first. How did they get there? For generations, the answer seemed obvious: the ice-free corridor. A gap between two massive ice sheets, the Laurentide covering eastern Canada and the Cordilleran along the Rocky Mountains. When the ice melted enough, a corridor opened between them, creating a pathway from Alaska down into the continental United States. It made perfect sense, except for one problem. New geological evidence revealed the corridor didn't open until 13,400 years ago, and even when it opened, it stayed uninhabitable for another 800 years. No vegetation, no animals, nothing to eat, no reason to walk through it. It would have been a death march through barren wasteland. Meanwhile, archaeological sites south of the ice sheets date to 14,600 years ago or older. The math doesn't work. People were already living south of the ice sheets a full 1,000 years before the corridor even existed. The corridor theory was wrong, so if they didn't use the corridor, how did people carrying distinctly Native American DNA end up south of the ice sheets, thousands of years before the corridor even opened? The answer lies along the Pacific coast, the Kelp Highway hypothesis. Instead of walking inland through ice, they took boats. They followed the coastline from Beringia down through what's now British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California. The coastal route was rich with resources: kelp forests, seals, sea lions, shellfish, salmon runs, everything needed to sustain a coastal population moving south along the shore. Evidence for this theory keeps mounting. 13,000-year-old footprints found on Calvert Island in British Columbia prove people were walking along the coast exactly where the hypothesis predicted. Sites in Oregon and Idaho dated to 16,000 years ago show human presence, thousands of years before the ice corridor opened. The genetics support it too. DNA from ancient remains along the Pacific coast shows continuity with populations from Alaska, suggesting a wave of migration that hugged the shoreline rather than cutting through the interior, which meant the textbooks had the route backwards. This completely inverts our mental image of the first Americans. We picture hardy Ice Age hunters trudging through snow and tundra, spearing mammoths on frozen plains, but the reality was likely very different. Coastal people, maritime adapted, moving by boat from island to island, beach to beach, following an endless buffet of seafood and marine mammals. The Kelp Highway wasn't just viable, it was probably easier than walking. The ancient Beringians who stayed behind in Alaska, Sunrise Girlchild's people, eventually disappeared, or more accurately, they were absorbed. Around 6,000 years ago, a back migration occurred. Northern Native American populations, descendants of the group that had gone south, came back north into Alaska. They either replaced or interbred with the remaining Ancient Beringians until that distinct genetic lineage vanished from the modern gene pool. Today's Athabascan populations show some genetic traces that might be Ancient Beringian ancestry, but it's been diluted by thousands of years of mixing. The Beringian standstill hypothesis explains something that confused geneticists for years. Why do all Native Americans, from the Arctic to Argentina, share certain genetic signatures that don't exist anywhere else? Why is there a clear genetic bottleneck, a reduction in diversity, that suggests all Native Americans descend from a relatively small founding population? Because they do. That founding population spent thousands of years isolated in Beringia, cut off from Asia, developing their own unique genetic identity before spreading into the Americas. The story isn't simple. It never is with human migration. There were probably multiple waves, different groups taking different routes at different times. The ancient Beringians weren't the only people in Beringia. There's evidence of earlier populations, possibly dating back 34,000 years, who left traces in lake sediments and ancient campsites scattered across what is now the seafloor. But what the DNA from Sunrise Girl Child proved beyond doubt is this: the journey to the Americas wasn't a single crossing. It was a process. A long, slow, complex process of migration, adaptation, isolation, and diversification that played out over tens of thousands of years in a landscape that has since drowned beneath the Bering Sea. The Beringian standstill wasn't a pause in the story of human migration. It was a chapter all its own, a crucial chapter that transformed a group of East Asian migrants into the founding population of two entire continents. And it took the DNA of a 6-week-old infant, buried with care 11,500 years ago in the heart of Alaska, to finally tell us what happened during those lost millennia. The story wasn't in the textbooks, it was in her bones. Here on Lost Evidence, we're uncovering the DNA discoveries that are rewriting pre-Columbian American history. Which ancient mystery should we investigate next? The Viking settlements that lasted generations in Canada, the pre-Columbian plagues that were already in the Americas before Europeans arrived, or the mysterious population that vanished without leaving any descendants? Leave a comment and let us know what evidence you want us to uncover.